Good evening, Western Standard viewers. I'm Nigel Hannaford, and I'm down on the grounds of the Global Energy Show, the second largest show in the world. Only Texas is bigger. This is an incredible gathering of the industry of more than 700 companies developing the oil and the gas, and also the politicians who need to be here. Shannon Joseph is my guest. Shannon, would you call yourself a politician?
I would not.
She would not.
I'd call myself a doer.
You oh, well, you're drawing a very sharp distinction there, Shannon. Shannon Joseph is actually the chair of Energy for a Secure Future, which is an organization dedicated to expanding the natural gas industry in Canada, and with a very special interest in Indigenous participation. Would you have described your role any differently, Shannon?
No, I think that's an apt description. I would just add that we care about Canada's global energy role, where LNG is going to play this big role. We also care about Canada learning from the rest of the world about how to have a resilient energy system in Canada. How do we have affordable, abundant energy and a system that really delivers for Canadians all the time?
But also for the Far East. Something very significant happened in British Columbia last week, which is something I'd like you to talk about now. A pipeline. We wanted a pipeline. Apparently, we've got one.
That's right. And so very recently, I think last week, the BC government approved the Prince...
It was Friday.
Oh, Friday.
Yeah.
The BC government approved for a substantial start of the Prince Rupert gas transmission line. And what that means is that we're going to have another gas pipeline in British Columbia. We have the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is supplying LNG Canada. And eventually, phase one will eventually supply phase two. It's going to supply Cedar LNG, the majority Indigenous-owned one. But this one is supplying a whole other project called Silism's LNG. And the pipeline's always the hardest thing to build in Canada. So the fact that this thing is going to move ahead is very good news for that other project in BC taking place, and for us as a country getting more and more into the global market for LNG.
One of the things that struck me about this project, there's a little bit of a story behind it. There was already a right-of-way approved. And, of course, getting approvals is the thing that takes the 10 years in Canada. So how did that all fall into place?
Yeah. So they had a right of way, they had permitting, but they had to demonstrate that the pipeline had substantially started construction. If they had not demonstrated that, the permits would have expired. And then they would have had to start all over. And starting all over in 2025 would not have been a happy proposition, I think, for anyone. And so fortunately for the proponents, for the First Nation, Nisga'a Nation, they got it done. And they started building, in a challenging time. One of their neighboring nations started not being happy with the project, even though they had an impact benefit agreement that they had made along with the other nations on the route. But Nisga'a, got it done in their territory, and now the project's going to happen, and I think will deliver lots of benefits, not just for them, but for all the nations along the route, and not just in terms of kind of having a project, but the jobs and training. There's been a lot of kind of First Nations economic upskill because of CGL that has now been leveraged into getting that pipeline substantially started, and it's just going to be a good news story across the board for building that capacity and a better future.
So if I understand the situation correctly, there was a company 10 years ago that got this pipeline route approved.
Correct.
But couldn't or didn't proceed.
Yes.
It ended up with the ownership in the hands of the Haisla Nation.
Nisga'a.
Nisga'a.
Yes.
Okay, and that they then risked their own money to build enough pipeline under budget.
Under budget and on time, which is not something you hear a lot about for Canada, right?
Which allowed the Premier of BC, who is notably anti-hydrocarbon development, to say, nevertheless, this one can go ahead. How big is it?
So I just want to say one thing about the Premier of BC. I think BC has been moving along a spectrum of opinion on this. And so I think once upon a time, Premier EB would never talk about natural gas, would never talk about LNG. He had a trip to Asia in kind of his previous mandate and started to understand what the rest of the world deals with. And in the rest of the world, if you're Korea, if you're Japan, you're importing 94% of your energy or more. And that means you need to look around the world. Who's going to give me my energy? Mm-hmm. And you might be relying on Russia, and they were and still do for some of their energy. You might be relying on Qatar. You're relying on the United States, who is now the biggest exporter of gas in the world. But you're hoping for lots of partners, because if you put all your eggs in one basket, like Europe did with Russia, you can get a big surprise when Russia invades Ukraine. And I think the Asians don't want that. And I think that has started to move, I think, the political needle in BC. And the Premier was just in Asia again, and I think is very keen for BC to be a global energy partner now.
So he's telling them over in Asia that there is a business case.
He sure is. Yes. He knows there's a business case.
Well, would you anticipate that now that this project has received approval, others will follow?
I think that now that this project has received approval, an LNG project that is the same size as LNG Canada Train 1 approximately is going to have a way better chance of getting its final investment decision to get built. If you can't supply the LNG facility, you can't do anything. And I think this also bodes important for the conversation around the gas that will go into the pipe. As we know, in Canada, we've been talking a lot about diversifying to the world, but we need policy coherence. We want to build, baby, build, but we still have an emissions cap on the oil and gas industry that would make it hard for the people who have to put product in that pipe to send to Asia. And so, I'm hoping that now that we have this pipeline and another major project on the horizon, LNG Canada was the biggest infrastructure project in the country. Siliciums can be of a similar size. That our government in Ottawa is going to start thinking, hey, let's be coherent here if we want to be a global player, and change some of these policies so that our companies can have the confidence that they can make projects to fill those pipes.
What you say makes perfect sense, but even now I can sort of sense the heads shaking at the other end of the video. No, they won't do that, and we could go down that rocky road if we wanted, but we won't. What I would like to ask you is why this is happening now. I'm thinking of a time 10 years ago when if you had asked Google for a list of LNG projects proposed in British Columbia, you'd have probably had 20, maybe more. But anyway, certainly there was 20. Well, now we have one actually in operation, and the Prince Rupert,
gas transmission
line now approved. And this is great.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to the rest?
Well, I think a couple of things happened. One is, there was a down cycle overall in oil and gas after 2014. And that was around the time we were getting started and the United States was getting started. But there was that demand for energy anyway. And it's not a secret, it's certainly not a secret to your viewers, Canada does not have a very friendly policy environment. And so I think a combination of, and Canada's already more expensive to build things, right? Whereas the United States, if you're in the Gulf Coast, it's flat, it's warm all year, you can build very quickly. In northern British Columbia, there's a giant mountain range, it's freezing. Shorter construction season, higher costs. I think there were a lot of questions unresolved about how to ensure First Nations benefited from these projects, and so there was opposition to some of the projects that were in there, and there was a lot of reputational damage to Canada with these projects kind of falling apart when we had such good resource. But
I think you just said the magic word there. Then ensuring Indigenous representation and benefit. Now, with this Prince Rupert line, how important was that for the...
I think it was extremely important because, again, like Coastal GasLink, that pipeline has impact benefit agreements for the nations along the route. Mm-hmm. And, as we are seeing now with the recent deal that Enbridge did, where they sold ownership in existing gas pipelines, those benefit agreements maybe someday in the future, and I'm not a proponent or anything like that, are eligible for those kinds of ownership sharing and things like that. But they have to exist first. And I think now that we're in a world where people see that these things are possible, they're looking out. First Nations are looking at, and others are looking at what's a long-term opportunity if we work together with this company to make this thing happen, and how will it benefit our people for the long term. So I think that's an important part of it. But I'd still say, Nigel, in that first phase of things, we also things kind of fell apart policy-wise when the new Liberal government came in 2015, because they put in a lot of policies with a view of, frankly, shrinking the industry.
Excuse me, Big. So, to go back to something you said 5 minutes ago, we really need to lift the emissions cap.
Yes.
If that does not get lifted, all of this is great as far as it goes. This pipeline, I think you said, is drawing from the Montney in BC.
Yes.
There is some possibility, your word was optionality. I'm going to work that into an editorial soon.
Optionality, it's a great word.
I'm going to work that in. But so there's some possibility that this could be good for Alberta gas as well.
Today Alberta Gas is part of the United States LNG success story. We send 7 to 10% of the U.S. gas supply is Canadian gas. And Tourmaline was kind of the front runner in this, but ARC and most recently Canadian Natural have deals with Cheniere in the Gulf Coast, and they're gonna be supplying Europe. They are supplying Europe today. The companies that are already getting gas down there, and so that's been good for Alberta Gas. I think having a pipeline now, 2 pipelines going towards the BC coast, is going to create great options for our producers. And again, on the environmental issue, because I don't want people to think, oh, well, you just don't care. On the environmental issue, we can't forget the biggest lift on the emissions is displacing high-emitting fuels in Asia. And, when we shut down our production in Canada, the coal-fired plant construction in China could wipe that out in 3 weeks. All the emissions we think we saved, they've replaced, and there's one planet. And on this planet, there are still millions of people who don't have the energy they need to refrigerate, to sterilize medical equipment, to live, to get, to read books at night when the sun sets. And that is the problem people are solving. And when they start to solve that problem, they will be a greater ally to us in protecting the environment and all the rest of it. But Canada can be such an important player in helping millions of people solve that problem. And in doing so, protecting not only the atmosphere, but forests that get burned down for fuel and all the rest of it. I mean, and what I'm hoping and I'm excited about is that both federally and all the provincial governments are starting to have this bigger vision. And we need to hold that bigger vision, because I would say the First Nations who have been partners in these projects, they have had that bigger vision. They have been partnering with industry to advance that vision. And so it's time to all get behind it.
Last question, Shannon. When does the gas start flowing through the Prince Rupert line if everything goes according to plan?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's not completely certain. I mean, right now, Silicim's LNG, I think, has about 2 buyers that are, known for buying their gas. They still have to book buyers for more of the volume that would come out of that project than they currently have. But that work continues. And I think gas will start flowing in that line when they've found those buyers and they've secured those deals and they build that plant, then the gas will flow. It could be a few years, probably more than 5 years, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to say anything, but right now is the time to be selling the gas. In Asia, there are many contracts, long-term contracts that these countries have had with Russia. They start expiring in 2029. We still have a pretty high spot price for gas globally. That's going to encourage these new long-term contracts. And so Canada should be laser focused on making those deals, getting in there, replacing those Russian contracts, and having those deals in place that will make it possible to FID these projects and get them built. When they're built, the gas will be flowing. And if the rest of the project goes the way that first section of pipe went, then maybe it'll get done pretty quickly. But we need to be really focused on making it happen.
Shannon, a very big part of what you do is making that happen, making the quiet connections in the background that bring people together, give them confidence, and develop opportunities. It's God's work. Congratulations, and let's stay in touch on this.
Thank you so much.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.